Superman vs. Goku was one of the most popular debates in all of fiction. Even today, this matchup is discussed ad nauseum to the point of even a small-time Naruto YouTuber like myself having just made a video matching up these icons. But after that video dropped, due to the fact that current comic Superman is essentially composite comic Superman, one of my faithful subscribers, Oreo, decided to commission me to make a part 2, asking the question, what if current Superman, inheriting the scaling from his previous mainline forms due to the timelines merging into one, took on a similar version of Goku? With Superman having had a bit of an unfair advantage due to being around for much longer and therefore having had a greater amount of time to collect crazy feats, this video topic only seems right as a follow-up to the last. So that question is the one we'll be answering now. In other words, today we'll be exploring and breaking down current comic Superman versus composite Goku. Before we get started, it's worth shouting out my boy Oreo for the commission. Thank you for the 100, my guy. I really appreciate it. If you guys are interested in having me cover a topic of your choosing, feel free to click the link in my bio for commission links and get that rolling. The second thing we'll need to go over is the fact that we'll be using the same standard battle stipulations we used last time, so they'll be in character with intent to bring the other down, even kill them if necessary. They'll be fighting in an empty void with no interruptions, and we'll be using verse equalization. This means they'll both use the same energy type for their attacks, so we can all reasonably talk about how their abilities would meaningfully interact. Also, the forms we'll be covering are, again, current comic Superman and composite Goku, meaning every form of Goku and every feat he's ever accomplished in those forms is on the board. That said, with all of his scaling, where exactly does composite Goku actually scale? Something that's interesting about doing this video at this time is it comes on the heels of a statement from Toritaro, the guy writing and drawing the Dragon Ball manga, stating, "I like almost all of the works that exist from Dragon Ball. For me, everything is more or less canon because I've seen everything. After that, it's not really my role to know who determines what is and what is not. And I think it's better if each fan decides for himself what is or what is not in his own continuity, and I think it's better that way. For example, Dragon Ball Online is a game I've played in the past, and it's also a part of the canon for me." So no, this doesn't mean that every piece of Dragon Ball content is canon. It means that Toyotaro thinks that the best way to go about things is to have fans themselves decide what is or isn't canon, as opposed to himself. So for the sake of this video, everything that's been published as official Dragon Ball content is canon. The mainline manga, anime, games, movies, everything. That being said, just how strong is this absolute highball massive wank version of the legendary Super Saiyan Son Goku? In terms of attack potency, Goku is an absolute monster. In the previous video, we got Goku to multiversal due to his punches clashing with Beerus and threatening to destroy the entire universe. This would include multiple dimensions, all of which are universal in size, meaning their attacks were going to destroy multiple universes. The problem with trying to get him higher than that with the official mainline story material is, despite going up in power drastically, you have to infinitely exceed multiversal in order to get into the next tier, which he does not. So basically, even a billion times multiversal is still multiversal, not above it. However, with all of his scaling into consideration, he's far beyond that. One of the strongest versions of Goku that we get is the Xenoverse version. In these games, Goku scales to Demigra, the demon god, who's capable of wiping out the entirety of history, which includes infinite timelines, with Goku even being able to stop his multiverse wiping attack with just his base physicals. This concept of infinite timelines is restated multiple times in both the Xenoverse games, as well as the Dragon Ball Heroes story, and history itself is considered to be the combination of all of these infinite timelines. So Demigra was threatening an infinite multiverse with his raw power alone. That gets him bare minimum to high complex multiversal, but probably more accurately to hyperversal, especially since the place Demigra is fighting Goku in exists outside of space-time, transcending time altogether, with this idea being reinforced by the fact that lower-level characters like Fu are also stated to transcend space-time. Since space-time in the context of the games would include the infinite timelines we spoke about, this would require at least a transcendence of the infinite multiverse. None of these characters are stated or shown to go beyond all dimensionality, so we can't get them to outerversal, but it's still ridiculously impressive nonetheless. Here's where I'll inject my opinion on this particular scaling, before we go on to the craziest stuff. I think the most consistent and defendable placement for this version of Goku that we talked about so far is between that hyperversal and potentially outerversal range. That might even be a bit of a reach, as it takes a little bit of a super generous interpretation to get there, but I do think hyperversal is probably perfect. That doesn't mean there aren't arguments for higher interpretations though, especially with other forms. So let's get into them. One of the interpretations that people use comes from Dragon Ball Heroes, where we do get another another demon god, someone who's like Demigra, who Goku scales to, playing a Dragon Ball game on their 3DS. This could imply that they view the world of Dragon Ball as fiction and thus infinitely transcend the dimensions of Dragon Ball's hyper timeline. However, it's never clarified if this demon god is playing a game based on their reality or if they're actually viewing their reality itself as a game. So this is what I mean when I say you have to be pretty generous here if you want to get them any higher than hyperversal. If you were being generous, you would get this demon god to outer, as they would be fully transcending the dimensionality of the Dragon Ball reality, going beyond it entirely, but still being bound by the concept of dimensionality in the higher fictional dimension where the demon god is. If you're extra generous, you could say that all of the demon gods scale to one another, and that would mean that Goku scales there as well. This is an obvious highball wank scale, so I'd never use it, but you could use this to get him to high outer. Another argument for getting Comp Goku to these ridiculous levels or beyond is by using Jump Force. One of the main plot points in the Jump Force story is Prometheus attempting to join all worlds together and rule this united world as a god. He does this from a realm where he's capable of viewing all of their worlds on screens, One Piece, Dragon Ball, etc. He says his job as a keyman is to transmit the stories from their fictional worlds to the real world, our world, but never interfere. However, he's grown tired of watching them mess up and disappoint him, so he's taking it into his own hands, joining all worlds together and becoming their god. So if you take the highest end interpretation of this, you could say he's talking about joining all of their worlds as well as the real world where we reside, and then is planning on transcending that into godhood over our real universe. That would definitionally be boundless. However, the problem with that is that when he says all worlds, he could just mean all of their worlds. What he says directly is that it's their job to influence the real world by giving them access to the stories of the Jump Force worlds, but because the humans kept failing him, he now wants to unite the worlds and guide them directly as their god to fulfill his purpose as the Keyman. What is the purpose of the Keyman? The Keyman used this power of the Onyx books to convey the events of the Jump Force worlds to the real world as stories to indirectly affect the real world. So fulfilling the purpose of the Keyman is indirectly affecting the real world in a way that he sees fit by sharing the Jump Force world's stories. However, the humans of the Jump Force worlds keep failing him, so he wants to unite them to directly guide the events so they play out in the way he wants them to in order to indirectly affect the real world, fulfill his purpose in a way that he sees fit. That's a totally reasonable interpretation for this, and that wouldn't get him to boundless, that would just get him to high outer. If that's where you lean, this honestly would be really impressive, but just not as impressive as a lot of people think, because a lot of people take this to mean that he's boundless, and since Goku scales to him, he would also be boundless. Prometheus does exist in a realm outside of theirs, but it doesn't necessarily mean that he's in a space with a higher dimensionality. It could just be an alternate universe with the same spatial dimensions. And yes, he is capable of merging all of their universes into one, which would likely include the infinite timelines of some of these verses, including the ones in Dragon Ball, but even that would only get this feat to 5D or hyperversal, or at a high-end, high-outer versal. So if you're generous, you could get this version of Goku to boundless, but more realistically, he's closer to that hyperversal to outerversal tier, which is again consistent with the explanation I gave earlier in regards to Heroes and Xenoverse. The final scaling I'll cover here is the one that I think is actually the best for getting him to boundless. God Fusion Goku is undoubtedly the strongest version of Goku that we've ever seen by a mile. This version of Goku is from the Dragon Ball Z, the real 4D experience at Super Tenkaichi Budokai movies, which is an interactive 4D experience wherein the characters in the movie directly interact with and affect the audience. Not only does the 4D experience allow for the audience to feel shaking and even water coming from the fight, meaning the force from the fight itself is transcending that fictional dimension and affecting our own, at least that's how it's intended anyways, but Goku himself performs a fusion with the audience in order to defeat Broly. These things would meet some of the qualifications for boundless, but not necessarily all. The reason I say this is because boundless requires not being bound by the dimensional or conceptual aspects of the reality you reside within. Transcending those things entirely, aka not being bound by them, is one way to get to boundless, and he doesn't actually do that here. This usually requires being the literal creator of the entire fictional world in question, like the Presence from DC or the Divine Creator from Marvel Comics. This is due to the fact that these creators infinitely transcend that realm in a qualitative way and sometimes encompass it, being omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. However, usually one of the ways you can get into boundless is by being able to significantly affect something beyond the all-encompassing creator/force, which contains and embodies the entirety of a given fiction. So since Goku does go beyond his own fiction into the real world with that fusion, you can make a real argument for him being boundless here. He's no longer fully bound by the restrictions of that world, enabling him to absorb energy via a fusion from beyond his fictional world, and as I said earlier, even with the battle he has with Frieza, directly affects the real world. The question would then become a subjective one of two parts. One, does what he does qualify as significantly affecting something? And two, even if it does, he's still contained within his reality the whole time. He just draws energy from the real world. So maybe he has an aspect of his arsenal which breaches on Boundless, but his essence and physicals may not be. I personally think that seeing them crack the screen with clashes would imply that these characters would be able to break out of that reality and into ours, so I do think this version of Goku is Boundless, but that can be left up to you. With that said, Comp Goku should be getting to Boundless in terms of AP and durability if you take a relatively generous interpretation, and with the lowest reasonable interpretation of God Fusion Goku, he's still high outerversal. Speed is a lot easier to go over. He fights in timeless realms and his attacks can affect our world, covering an infinitely transcendental space instantly, so he casually gets into the immeasurable speed tier, more accurately irrelevant speed. His raw physicals allow for him to exist in and interact with spaces infinitely transcendentally above his own, so this one's really clear. Now, I know that was a lot and it's a ton of technical jargon, but we had to put some work in to get Goku as high as reasonably possible, so people cannot say that I'm lowballing him. But even with all of that, does this version of Goku stack up against current 2025 comic Man of Steel? In the last video, we got Superman to outerversal using a variety of scales, such as inflicting damage on the fabric of the 6th dimension, which is transcendental to the bleed, which is transcendental to the DC Infinite Multiverse, which is transcendental to the DC Infinite Microverse. Infinitely transcending an infinite reality once gets you to low outer, and transcending that said transcendental realm again would then be outer. Transcending that realm into a realm that's infinitely above that, or just being able to significantly affect said realm, would then get you into high outer. So Superman being able to damage the 6th dimension in the way that he did definitely makes him high outer. However, in the last video, we only got Superman to as strong as he needed to be. We didn't go beyond that for the sake of time. But for this video, he has to go infinitely beyond that to have any hope of dealing with Composite Goku. So does Big Blue have any feats to compete, or is he going to fall before God Fusion Goku? I'm gonna be so real with you right now. There are multiple ways to go about getting current Superman to Boundless. The most straightforward way is by using the Thought Robot or Cosmic Armor Superman. As I said in my last video, current Supes is an amalgamation of all of his previous mainline forms by virtue of the timelines all being merged into one, with each character inheriting the memories, experience, abilities, and even gear from previous forms. However, since Cosmic Armor Superman isn't technically an alternate timeline form, but rather that mainline Superman equipped with a special weapon, essentially, that may not necessarily apply. So let me clear up why that most certainly does. Current Superman is straight up stated by himself to be stronger than he's ever been, which would include every previous mainline form, including his Thoughtbot form. This means current Superman is simply above that version, so all of his scaling should apply to current Superman. Something else that I should clear up is why I used Superboy Prime scaling in my previous video. People are confused by that because they think that it's not Clark Kent, but Superboy Prime is Clark Kent, Kal-El, Superman from Earth Prime. So he is actually an alternate timeline version of Superman, not Superboy. That's why his scaling is fair to use here as well. But Thoughtbot Robot Superman's scaling is the one that's important here, so what does this mean for Kal-El? Thoughtbot Superman, otherwise known as Cosmic Armor Superman, is transcendental to Limbo, a realm which neither exists nor doesn't exist, and is where all of the forgotten characters reside, directly interacting with the comic book writers themselves. You could argue this alone gets Superman to Boundless via transcending a realm which directly interacts with the real-world writers. However, the thing that's most notable about this scan is that Cosmic Armor Superman, aka Thoughtbot Superman, is capable of not only feeling the reader breathe on the comic, but is also shown to reach outside of the comic to the reader. This would be Boundless by virtue of being able to interact with the real world and transcend his own fictional reality. But even if you don't like that logic, he's able to both reach out into the Overvoid and fight Mandrak in the Overvoid. The Overvoid is the literal page that the comic book is written on, which contains everything in DC and beyond, meaning that it's a part of the outside world. Being able to interact with the outside real world is also definitionally a requirement for Boundless, as Superman is no longer bound by his fictional reality and instead interacting with and going into the one outside of it, ours. Interestingly, Superman is also 100% aware that he's a comic book character, but accepts this as he understands that he has a specific purpose assigned by the writers themselves. Another fairly easy way to get Superman to Boundless is via upscaling from Mr. Mixie. We see in the world's funniest comic line that Mr. Mixie is capable of exiting their comic book world and coming into our real world. Mr. Mixie is a fifth-dimensional imp who's infinitely below the monitors, including Mandrak, who Superman is relative to. This would mean that Mr. Mixie is boundless and Superman upscales from there. This is a feat a lot of people just attribute to comic book silliness and try to explain away, but being able to exit his fictional reality in totality and move into our real world is definitionally boundless, and there's no real way around it. The final way we'll get Big Blue to boundless is by using Clark scaling to the source. For context, the source is literally the source of all things, part of the Overvoid, which is, again, the literal pages of the comic. The source being the source of all things in the DC cosmology, containing all of the fictional reality and being responsible for producing it, means that the source is also, in fact, boundless, as it transcends the fictional reality altogether. The source is relative to Soulfire Darkseid, who Superman is also relative to, getting him to boundless once again. This is consistent with Superman breaking the source wall, which separates DC's fiction from everything outside of it, including the real world and other worlds of fiction. So breaking through this would, at minimum, be high outer, but likely boundless, as the source wall is what binds the DC fictional reality from everything else. Breaking the thing that binds the fictional reality means Superman should scale to or above it. Being above the thing that binds your fictional reality makes you, again, boundless. In terms of speed, it's basically the same as Goku. Superman also transcends time altogether, fighting in realms like the Overvoid, which is beyond time. That gets him to irrelevant speed. He's also able to casually destroy infinite multiverses in a finite time, which would qualify for immeasurable speed. So Clark and Goku are not only in the same tier in terms of power output and durability, but also in terms of speed. That being said, in this matchup, it's basically impossible to determine a winner. However, if I were to lean one side or the other, I'd lean towards the Man of Steel. The reason for this is the Mr. Mixie scaling. If Mr. Mixie is boundless and he's transcended by the monitors, with Mandrak, the Dark Monitor, being relative to Superman, you could argue that he's transcendental to one layer into boundless, which doesn't really make a lot of sense, but it's kind of just the way it is. I'd also just say that there's a lot more that you can poke at in Goku's boundless scaling, specifically the fact that the only thing that's really boundless is the fact that he's able to do a fusion with the audience, and this could just give him boundless energy transfer, but not necessarily boundless physicals, whereas Superman does just have boundless physicals. So if they were to box, Superman would just massively outscale him. But, you know, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Goku has better arguments, maybe I highballed or lowballed one or the other, maybe I missed some things. Let me know what you think in the comments below. With all that said though, it was fun putting this video together and I hope you enjoyed. If you did, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. But until next time, have an awesome day.